Welcome to Through Time Tales. Before we begin, like and subscribe if you like strange old stories. Today is the day we sit down and have a proper conversation about cavemen. You know the ones, barefoot, snarling, club-wielding caricatures who grunt at mammoths and somehow never figure out pants. Hollywood has done a spectacular job convincing us that our prehistoric ancestors were essentially violent toddlers with facial hair. They're always cold, always confused, and never, ever capable of anything more advanced than poking things with sticks. The problem, of course, is that this image is complete nonsense. Entertaining, yes. Accurate? Not remotely. Because if you dig a little deeper beneath the pelts, the poor posture, and the cartoonish grunts, you find something surprising. You find intelligence, ingenuity, resilience. People who didn't just survive the most unforgiving environments Earth could throw at them, but actually thrived. They built tools, formed communities, made art, and passed down knowledge with a consistency that would make most modern institutions blush. In other words, they weren't idiots, they were early. It's tempting to assume that just because someone didn't invent TikTok or central heating, they must be intellectually inferior. But that's not how evolution works. In fact, the further back you go, the more you realize something awkward. Early humans weren't less intelligent. They just had different priorities. Like not being eaten, or freezing, or falling into a ravine while chasing something that really didn't want to be dinner. Let's take a stroll back through time. Not all the way to dinosaurs. We're not merging timelines like a bad sci-fi movie, but to somewhere around 2.5 million years ago. That's when Homo habilis first shows up in the fossil record, clutching a rock in what we can only assume was a moment of sheer genius or complete boredom. Either way, the result was the first known stone tool. Not a bad start, really. From there, things picked up speed. Homo erectus came along and said, "Hey, that rock knife is cute, but what if we made it sharp on both sides?" Then they discovered fire, figured out how to carry it, and cooked their food like civilized creatures. That's right. They didn't just eat raw meat in a cave like cartoon savages. They cooked, they shared meals, and they sat around campfires long before campfires were trendy. And while all this was happening, something else rather curious was brewing. Language. Now, we don't know exactly when humans started talking, but at some point grunts turned into gestures, gestures into sounds, and sounds into something dangerously close to conversation. It's entirely possible that before they could write, they were already telling stories, maybe even jokes. Imagine that, a Neanderthal with a sense of humor, cracking wise about mammoth hunting while chewing on roasted roots. It's not impossible. In fact, it's pretty likely. And speaking of Neanderthals, let's clear something up. They weren't the comic relief of the Stone Age. They were skilled, social, and clever in ways we're only just beginning to appreciate. They buried their dead. They made tools. Some even decorated themselves with feathers and shells, which frankly suggests better fashion sense than most music festivals. They lived in close-knit groups, cared for the injured, and may have even developed a sense of spirituality. That's not brutish, that's human. Meanwhile, back at the cave, something extraordinary was happening. Actual article, not doodles in the dirt, but detailed, expressive cave paintings that showed animals, hunts, and handprints so ancient they make the Mona Lisa look like a teenager. These weren't random scratches, they were deliberate, beautiful, and possibly meaningful. Maybe they were records of hunts, maybe they were early attempts at communication, or maybe, just maybe, they were someone's way of saying, "Look what I did, I existed." Which, if you think about it, is what we all want, even now. Of course, no discussion of early humans would be complete without fire. Glorious, life-saving fire. They didn't just discover it, they tamed it, kept it alive, used it to transform food, fend off predators, and gather in the dark like some ancient version of a dinner party. The fact that we still treat fire with the same fascination, candles, bonfires, fireplaces, says something. Namely, that our ancestors got it right the first time. But here's the real kicker. These so-called primitives lived in balance with their environment in a way we've never quite managed. They moved with the seasons, followed animal migrations, used every part of what they hunted, and left barely a trace behind. Their footprints faded, ours are turning into carbon sinkholes, and yet we still think we're smarter. You see, the myth of the dumb caveman isn't just wrong, it's convenient. It lets us feel superior. It lets us point at the past and say, "Look how far we've come," while quietly ignoring the fact that early humans built sustainable communities without melting the ice caps. They didn't need skyscrapers, they had shelters. They didn't need factories, they had flint. They didn't invent politics, which, frankly, may be their greatest achievement. And no, they didn't build the internet, but they did build connections, families, traditions, knowledge passed down not through TikToks or status updates, but through stories told around firelight. And those stories kept them alive. That's not primitive, that's brilliant. So the next time someone uses the word caveman as an insult, try to remember, these were people who made fire from nothing, carved weapons from bone, painted their lives on stone, and survived the Ice Age with no roof, no shoes, and absolutely zero Wi-Fi. They weren't stupid, they were just early, and honestly, they were doing just fine. Of course, for all their innovation, these early humans didn't have it easy. Survival wasn't a casual affair. There were no painkillers, no prescription glasses, and definitely no ergonomic chairs. And yet somehow they handled illness, injury, and childbirth with a degree of competence that still surprises archaeologists today. Evidence from ancient burial sites shows healed fractures, arthritis, even amputations that had time to mend, suggesting that someone was doing the prehistoric equivalent of nursing. That means someone stayed behind when others went hunting, someone gathered herbs, someone chewed bark or applied clay or whispered comforting nonsense into someone else's ear because, frankly, that's all they could do. They didn't have antibiotics, but they had care. They didn't have hospitals, but they had each other. And for the most part, it worked. And if you think parenting was just leaving kids in a pile of leaves and hoping for the best, think again. Babies were a full-time job even back then. Squishy, noisy bundles of risk in a world that was actively trying to kill them. There's evidence of toddlers surviving to adulthood with congenital illnesses, which strongly implies someone carried them, fed them, and fought to keep them alive. These were not cold-hearted brutes. They were parents, exhausted, unshowered, prehistoric parents, just like the modern ones, but with better survival instincts and less unsolicited advice from Instagram. Their societies weren't built on formal governments or spreadsheets, but they functioned. Groups of 20 to 50 people, often moving together, sharing food, tools, and whatever passed for gossip. Roles weren't rigid. Sure, some hunted, others gathered, but evidence shows that women also hunted, men also gathered, and old people often became the keepers of knowledge, wisdom, or just long-winded stories that everyone had heard 10 times but politely listened to anyway. They weren't building pyramids, but they were building community. And unlike most HOA meetings today, theirs probably didn't end in lawsuits. As for gender roles, they were likely far more flexible than we give them credit for. The whole man hunt, woman cook routine is mostly a modern projection, convenient, simplistic, and delightfully wrong. Studies of modern forager societies, as well as archaeological evidence, suggest a far more balanced system. Women in ancient Peru hunted with spears. Men in Ice Age Europe may have nursed the injured. The idea of rigid roles is a relatively recent invention, right around the time we invented chairs and decided to argue about everything. Even their food habits were diverse. They weren't just gnawing on mammoth legs and berries. They roasted tubers, cracked nuts, fermented fruit, and ground seeds with stones. If you've ever been to a trendy health cafe and paid $14 for something involving chia, congratulations, you've just rediscovered what a caveman was eating 20,000 years ago. They had seasonal diets, forage variety, and a deep understanding of what could be eaten and what would kill you, which is more than you can say for most of us staring blankly at a microwave instruction label. Let's talk about mobility. You think you're clever for hitting 10,000 steps on your fitness tracker? These people walked for days. They migrated across continents. Some groups crossed icy land bridges and island hopped into new worlds, carrying tools, children, and whatever dried meat hadn't been stolen by wolves. And they did this without maps, GPS, or travel insurance. They moved with intention, followed stars and seasons, remembered terrain, and passed down routes orally. Because it turns out that if you can't write, you remember things a lot better. Eventually, agriculture happened. Slowly, reluctantly. Contrary to popular belief, it wasn't a light bulb moment where someone said, "Hey, why hunt when I can grow wheat and develop back pain?" It was gradual and in many cases resisted. Farming meant staying in one place. It meant hierarchy, property, conflict, taxes, priests, and eventually people yelling about zoning laws. But before all that, there were thousands of years when humans lived in relative balance with their world, adapting to it instead of paving over it. And the shift to farming didn't necessarily make life easier. It just made it different. Bones from early agricultural societies show shorter stature, more malnutrition, and a shocking rise in dental problems. Turns out wheat isn't the solution to everything. The old forager life may have been hard, but it was active, varied, and, dare we say, healthier. You didn't own much, but you weren't drowning in clutter either. No closets full of clothes you never wore. No email inbox. Just survival, fresh air, and the occasional mammoth stew. Which brings us to the final point. The real reason we think of cavemen as dumb is that we want to feel like we've progressed. We want to believe that skyscrapers, space rockets, and smartwatches are proof that we're better. But intelligence isn't about how many gadgets you have. It's about how well you adapt. And by that measure, early humans were doing exceptionally well. They lasted millions of years. We've had light bulbs for 150 and already we're panicking about the climate. They didn't build empires, they didn't conquer nations, they didn't need to. They raised children, created beauty, honored their dead, and survived in environments that would reduce most of us to sobbing puddles of unshaven panic. They were clever, resourceful, and frankly a lot more impressive than the guy on Twitter who thinks cavemen were just monkeys with rocks. So let's give them their due. Let's stop calling people cavemen when they act like morons and start appreciating what the real ones accomplished, because they weren't behind us. They were our foundation, and they weren't failing at life. They were mastering it, one sharpened stone at a time. And that's where we'll leave it for today. Thanks for joining me on this overdue correction to the history of early humans. Until next time, stay warm, stay curious, and maybe don't mock the ancestors who could survive an ice age without shoes.